road and we want to keep it white. And if we dragged her N-word body up and down the street, maybe every other N-word would know that they're not welcome. And just the continued threats of physical harm and personal attack and the slurs. And my friend said, oh, I'm going to say something. And I said, no, you're not. Their friends will get here faster than ours. And if you think they won't hit a woman, you're wrong. So we're going to get the check and we're going to leave. And that was what we did. And we got to the car and I said, the answer is yes. And my friend looked at me and she said, yes to what? And I said, yes, you can ask every uncomfortable question that's on your mind right now. And we had a tear-filled conversation. My friends are not racist, but they have blind spots. And I called my friend the other day and I said, how did that experience in Beatty change your perspective of racism? And she said it didn't. I've always known that racism was disgusting. What I realized was not seeing color has made me oblivious to it. You told me you were not welcome in that town. You told me how this was going to end, and I dismissed it and insisted that I was right. You saw the skinheads immediately. I didn't. You heard them. I didn't hear them. Even when you told me to listen, it wasn't until you told me specifically what to hear that I heard it. And then when I wanted to respond, you told me that that was wrong. And then when we were going to get away, you told me that you should drive because you know how to get away from people like this. She said, that hurt. And what I realized is that in that moment, socioeconomics didn't matter, your education level didn't matter. They hated you strictly because of the color of your skin. And that was all that mattered. And that's privilege. And when she said that's privilege, it clicked to me because I know conceptually and denotatively what privilege means, but that made sense. And she said, I have never been terrified for my safety strictly because of my skin color. And that's your reality. You were afraid the entire drive and you said it and I dismissed it. And I can avoid the places where I don't feel safe because of my skin color. You don't get that luxury. You have to live among us. That's privilege. And again, they're not racists. My friends are not racists. They didn't know it was happening because it has never happened to them, but it is my reality. And we all have those blind spots because our life experience has taught us different. Where growth happens is when we can acknowledge those blind spots, and I have them too. Just this week, I had a mind-blowing revelation and critical blind spot that I'm researching and I'm looking at now, because that's where change happens, is that self-reflection and being sure that we correct our views. And I'm thankful that we're creating these judgment-free zones because it's critical. And I want you to understand, I have been where most of you are sitting, in this position where you know you have questions, you're scared to ask them, it's uncomfortable to ask them. But in middle school, I saw Black people for the first time in my life. And I was, on this particular day, I was running through the halls because these girls wanted to jump me. And I finally looked at them, I said, why do you want to jump me? What is this about? And they looked at me and they said, you think you're white? And I said, I am the only Black person I have ever known. I know I am not white. America has taught me that I'm not white. I know that I'm Black and I know what that means in America. I don't have anyone to teach me the culture. My parents are white. My brother is Native American and Hispanic. I don't have anyone to teach me. Will you teach me? And at first they thought I was kidding, but my entire middle school, I was everyone's project as they taught me different cultures and different societal norms and all of these things that my parents just couldn't teach me, not because they didn't want to, but it just wasn't their experience. And I asked them every uncomfortable question I could think of, and they listened with an open heart and they didn't judge me. I genuinely wanted to learn and they became my greatest teachers, but I never dismissed anything that they said. And I think that that's where we're at now. And I just ask everyone to please remember my friends who told me in Beatty that I was being ridiculous. I wasn't being ridiculous. I was right. I was not welcome in that cafe and I knew it. But it's easy to minimize or dismiss something simply because it isn't or hasn't happened to you. And if you're anything like my friends in that moment, and even when I talked to her the other day, she was like, I just feel so helpless with everything going on. And I looked at her and I said, you are anything but. You have one of the most powerful positions right now, because what you get to do is when your friends tell you that racism isn't real, you get to tell them what happened to us in Beatty, and they will listen to you, but they would dismiss me. There's power in that. And I think that if we all embrace that responsibility, we are going to create change. And I'm educated and I'm successful. I have 2 white parents. I still get called the N-word. Just last month, I was threatened by a white supremacist as I was driving up Charleston with my kids. I'm going to be asked at Target to show my receipt to prove that I paid for the toilet paper in the bottom of my cart. And the girl who comes and asks me is going to continue to explain that her manager's making her ask me, and if I look different, I probably wouldn't be asked. That is my reality. And my parents, even though they're white, and I grew up in a very white world, I don't get to inherit their privilege, but I do rely on it. I rely on their privilege and yours to take our messages to tables that I will simply never be invited to. You will have audiences that will never hear me, that would dismiss me, but will listen to you. And there's so much power in that. And that's where change happens. When we hear others' perspectives and we have the courage to stand with them and ensure that they don't continue to have these experiences alone. And by being here today, you've committed to being part of that change. And on behalf of all of us who've been on the receiving end of racism, we thank you for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm going to throw it over to Carmen to lead us into our first portion.
So why talking about race matters? This is a perfect example. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing that, because that leads us into why it's important to have conversations like this and to use your privilege in order to have this conversation, because we're talking about empowerment and tools, and we're talking about individual journeys that can make the change come about. Number one, everyone has what is called a racialized identity. Now, we could be here for 5 hours, but we're not going to talk about how the word race is a social construct and how it started in the Spanish Inquisition, but we're not going to go there. But we do have to keep it simple. We all have a racialized identity that has come our way. And that identity is a major impact on a person's life. That means the way you live, the way that you interact, the way that you are employed, the way that even how your health care is taken into context. So everyone has that, and it has a significant impact on your life. Race, again, is defined as a social construct in American life in terms of identifying and certain things are pointed and specialized or stereotyped as being connected to an identity. And after a while, it's, if you've ever played the game telephone, it gets further and further away from the truth as people repeat it. So it's a social aspect of it. And like Elizabeth shared, is she may have had her privilege, but she cannot inherit that privilege because she's a woman of color, and that's what her reality is in American life. And that's one of the reasons why having a discussion about race really matters, because the data is there. It's not an imagination. It's not something that just popped up out of anywhere. The data is there. It is documented. It's the awareness and how we communicate it forward that we really need to move forward and inspire those conversations. And of course, at the ADL, the tools that are available for you to continue to have these conversations. And they're going to be a little uncomfortable. And discomfort is not always a bad thing, but you cannot continue to tolerate poor behavior, and that's not a part of who you are and why your life's important. Katrina, is this you and I together, ma'am?
Yes. Thank you so much, Carmen, for walking us through that.
Sure.
So in just a moment here, we're going to be going through a series of definitions and examples just to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to some of these really important terms that we're talking about, hearing in the news, seeing on social media. So Ian, if you could take us to our first slide. So this first word here is implicit bias, and we hear this a lot. Sometimes it's called unconscious bias or attitudes. This is something that we don't necessarily do on purpose. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes it can be, though. So one of those things that was that it can affect people unintentionally in a group, specifically just because of their membership. So like Elizabeth shared with her story, she did not inherit that privilege that her parents had. And unfortunately, that left her open to a lot of bias within the community that she was living in. Carmen, would you like to share the examples?
Well, the example, as you see above in front of you, is from the MBER, which does the research of applicants. And this is a system of employment where a resume is sent in. Before they even look at the qualifications, they'll look at the name. And if the name is quote unquote too black sounding by the stereotypic name there, they usually don't get seen. You've probably also seen some things on some of the magazine shows, like who will stop for a cab if they're hailing a cab. So that is another form of implicit bias, and people's identification towards that.
Thank you. So the other word on this slide is privilege, and that is also something that we've started to talk about a bit as well. And privilege is something that is often unrecognized. You don't realize it until you have an experience with a friend or a family member or a coworker that has a different outlook and perspective than you do. Just like Elizabeth shared with her own personal story, her friends didn't realize that privilege that they carried with them until that interaction happened. And that's one of those things, is that we need to be mindful of taking stock of the privileges that we have, and not necessarily in a bad way or in a guilty fashion, but what can we do to help lift up other people's voices with that privilege? What can we do to help improve the world around us with that privilege? Carmen?
Yeah, and so most definitely you're seeing that if you're watching any kind of news is about privilege. There's a current case going on now where two young men were dealing with law enforcement, had the same amount of points, did the same crime. It was almost an identical crime. One got 2 months in county jail and the other one got 26 years in prison. And then you look at it, and then the privilege is into place. The gentleman that got the 2 months in county jail happened to be white, and the gentleman that got the 26 years happened to be African American. So people's perspective and dealing with stereotypes and things that you may not have to think about. I know, just in terms of in speaking towards women, we have a situation that we have to think about how we go out into the world sometimes. That is another form of privilege. So it's just about how you relate and how you're exposed and the impact of stereotypes and how you interact with people. It's almost like being armorized for that. And when you live in a position of privilege, you don't realize that because there's no awareness to it.
Next slide, Ian. Thank you. So Carmen, you want to take us through these definitions?
Sure. I'm going to make sure I got them right. Okay. So race refers, as it says there, you're intelligent, is biology. I always like to use the establishment. I'm a full supporter of race being a social construct. If any of you get into a car accident and you need my blood, and I'm saying blood transfusion, you're not going to turn into a 55-year-old woman of color. But in terms of race, it's just a classification system. It was created for social and political reasons. Thoroughly for that. There is more, there are actually the genetic and biological differences within racial groups are defined by society, but it's not a biological connection for what it is. So that's why you have more of a focus of trying to identify someone ethnically in terms of they're Asian American, African American, Caucasian, which is an actual place, the Caucasus Mountains, and that history that goes into it.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The other definition here is racism, which is the marginalization, of course, of people of color or anyone who's oppressed based on a social construct. And of course, some really difficult examples are things like lynching, hate crimes, the use of racial slurs. But there are so many different forms of racism that are both overt and things that we don't think of at all, things that are considered socially acceptable at this point. Carmen, do you have anything else to add?
No, you hit it right on there, overt and covert. And then, you know, as you expand your experience, you'll learn more about coded language that's used on the regular. People of color, we call ourselves multilinguists because we speak our language. We almost speak our cultural language. We also speak a foreign language. And then we also speak a coded language of the code words that are used that we have to be aware of.
Thank you. And this last word.
Structural racism. Now, this is what you're seeing played out in front of your televisions all the time in terms of systematic racism, which is when you take a life factor and mix it to a system in which everyone is supposed to be fed into, that usually works to the advantage historically towards white America for people of color. And you see it in so many different systems. And that information is being put out now. So it's there, it can be seen. It's not something that, oh, you know, they're just taking it too personal. In particularly, I believe a slide is going to come up and discuss the issue of what's called generational wealth and the streams of revenue and transfer of wealth. And this is data that's proclamated and shown that there is a study that white families hold 90% of the national wealth in this country. Latinos hold 2.3% of that wealth, and African-American families hold 2.6. Not only that, during the Great Recession, a lot of the minority families were hit hard with that wealth gap that's taking place. So just put it in perspective, if for every $100 that a white family earns in income, Black families only earn $57.30 of that. That is a significant wealth gap. And with that wealth gap, that means paying for good health care, that means appropriate housing, that means location and living in places where the water is not affecting. Water affects health, health affects your ability to get health care. So the systems are putting up the obstacles. So that's what they mean by structural racism.
Thank you. So in just a moment, we're going to be showing you 3 individual slides. Now, we would love to have you all share your answers in the chat. The important thing to remember during this is that we all need to be kind and respectful towards one another using the chat feature. And as we go through these questions, understand that everyone is feeling uncomfortable, and that's okay. If you're not comfortable sharing your answer with the whole group, you can always share it directly to myself as one of the hosts, and we would be happy to share those answers out loud without the information. So here we go. So this first question here says, when were you first aware of your race? Do you want to take a few moments and answer that in the chat? And as those answers start to populate, we'll go ahead and start sharing those out loud.
Katrina?
Yes.
Can I make a comment to one of our participants, because she makes a very, very good point about land ownership, and I believe that's Ms. Williams.
Absolutely. While we're waiting for these answers to come through, definitely.
Yeah, because that goes back to what I was discussing in terms of power and land power. And if you really dig into the American history, and particularly the Constitution and how it was before it was amended and bended and whatnot, it was set up for the landowners in order to have the most power. And it's one of the reasons why you had the creation of the Electoral College also. So that's very much so. So when I saw that come up, I was trying not to jump up in my seat, and I said, yes, 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 because you're right on point, Ms. Williams. Thank you.
Absolutely. So a lot of you here in the chat are saying early elementary school, some high school. Some folks are even saying longer than that, which is really interesting. We've got a few answers, and it says maybe even pre-K. And the reality is that children are well aware of the differences of people and what they look like. Children are not colorblind. They can see it very clearly. They have questions, and oftentimes they just simply want an answer. It doesn't need to be a long, complicated answer. This needs to be an answer that's honest and from the right place. Ian, can we go to the next question? What do you remember from childhood about how you made sense of human differences, and perhaps what confused you? So especially since many of you are sharing that you realized that race was a difference between many people at an early age, this is an opportunity to share something. It looks like we've got a few responses already. Mm-hmm. How did you make sense of these human differences?
Mm.
Carmen, are you seeing some ones that you'd like to share out?
Well, no, because and the thing about it is the unknown throws a lot of people off balance. And so it's not unusual to say, you know, I thought it was weird, because it is weird to you. You have not been made aware of it. We want to try to empower people to feel comfortable to ask questions, but understand you need to be very careful about it. I think someone made a comment about hair. Okay. And I can't speak for myself, and Elizabeth, maybe you can chime in here. People want to put their hand, they're like, well, can I tell you? I'm like, no, don't touch my hair. Let's talk about it, because it's actually a flat follicle, a wavy follicle. There's different things and conversations like that. But I have some dear friends who are not African-American, and their hair is just as curly as mine too. So it's an interesting conversation. But saying it when you were that young, it was weird to you, that's normal. That was your experience, but you're not a child anymore. Now you're going towards more awareness. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people had these, they would see these childhood differences, right? And they would usually go to their parents who looked like them.
Yeah.
And get an understanding that made sense. And I'll tell you, you know, I had a really different perspective because I didn't have anyone who looked like me. And as a child, and it has changed my entire view forever, and I still do it, but I have a game I play, and I've been playing it since I was 5. It's called I Wonder If We're Related. And when you're mixed with, like, I was left at an airport. I don't know what day I was born. I only found out 3 years ago what my races are. And so when you can be mixed with anything, you can be related to anyone and everyone. And so from the time I was little, I would look at people and say, oh, you know what? She likes bows. Like, I like bows in her hair. I wonder if we're related. We like the same songs. I wonder if we're related. And I didn't know how unnormal that was until I was talking to my friend a couple years ago. And I was like, yeah, I was getting a coffee, and this girl, we were talking about music, and she likes these obscure music, the artists that I do. I wonder if we're related. She's like, stop it. You say this every day. What do you mean by that? And I said, no, you know, like, don't you ever just meet people and wonder, oh, I wonder if we're related? And she was like, no, most of us know that we're not related to everyone or anyone. And I said, well, that's interesting. Well, what did you think about me the first time you met me? She was like, oh, I loved your hair. I love this. I love that. And I was like, Lisa, that's literally every single way we're different. You just said everything you like was every way that we're different. She was like, well, what did you think? I said, the first time I saw you, you had a floral pleated skirt and a yellow shirt. Yellow's my favorite color. I wonder if we're related. So it's interesting how we look at the world and how we fill in those blanks and capitalize on those differences and try to make them make sense in our minds.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jane Elliott says that we're all 85th cousins, if you really want to break it down. So,
nice to meet you all, family.
Right?
Family.
So our last question for large group discussion is, how, if ever, did an adult give you any help thinking about racial differences? How, if ever, did any adult give you help thinking about racial differences?
Well, I do have a lot of cousins, of course. This is probably that interesting time that you had to have the conversations. I know, in particularly families that have African-American males, they start really having those kind of conversations early on to prepare for them to participate in the world. You know, if you go out, do you have your ID on you? Do you have your keys?
Yeah.
Okay, if you get pulled over by a police officer, this is what I need you to do to get home safe. And that's not a conversation that a lot of parents have.
I'll tell you, my sons are 5 and 6, and they already know big arms if you get pulled over and big fingers. So they see that there's nothing in your fingers. Stretch your fingers. But I'm also raising them to trust law enforcement, and they know that they're the helpers. And I mean, I have been telling them from the time they were little, and I have an 18-year-old stepson, your number one job is to make it home to me.
Yeah.
If you feel that you are being on the receiving end of injustice, or we will deal with that later, you get home. You be respectful, you do what you're told, you don't do anything without asking for permission, and big fingers, spread them as far as you can with your big arms. And those are just conversations you have to have.
Absolutely. I'd love to highlight a few of these stories that folks have shared in the chat. And I think some of the most impactful ones are looking at my parents and not doing what they've done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hearing those things and not repeating what they've seen. And that's such an important thing. I think that, you know, Carmen, especially you working with high schoolers on a regular basis, you see kids that get the opportunity to break those cycles on a regular basis.
Oh, most definitely.
And it's so important to do that. I see a lot of other comments in here just about, you know, having the general color blindness conversation and how you might realize that that's not what you'd put forth today. Growing up in a place where there were no other races, everyone was white. I don't remember having those kinds of discussions, which makes sense. If it's not around, then
not discussed. I think I thought I saw a comment. Somebody said they were from Tulsa or they grew up in Tulsa.
Yes, it looks like it's right here. I didn't have anyone really to help me with it. We lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My dad told me about the Tulsa massacre. He didn't whitewash it, but I didn't understand it.
Okay. All right. Because that's something that's most definitely being, since we are a world of media right now, there's about 12 stories out on about the Greenwood district, how it's been rebuilt up in the history of that. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate everyone taking the time to share and be open and honest. We know that that's not easy to ever do. And this is also just one part of this, right? It's going to take more than one conversation on one webinar on a Friday afternoon. So Carmen is going to walk us through ADL's Pyramid of Hate before we work our way towards questions and answers.
Okay, great, thank you. So the Pyramid of Hate is a component of our instruction of the world of difference. Again, another ADL resource in terms of talking about how this comes from the bottom up. This is not a bottom down kind of situation. It's definitely a moving up. So the bottom layer is what we would call biased or attitudes. And some examples would be insensitive remarks, stereotypes, fear of difference, and just misinformation that gets repeated and repeated. And some people feel if it's repeated enough, it becomes truth and becomes reality. The next level is what we call acts of bias. That would be bullying, ridicule, slurs, social avoidance. You know, you walk past, someone locks their door, someone holds their purse, so on and so forth. We already touched on this a little bit with systematic discrimination, the economic, political, financial, housing, segregation. Then we have bias motivated by violence. And that's when you get into your assaults, your murders, threats, terrorism, because that's what it needs to be called, terrorism. And then the top of this pyramid is genocides, which is the act or intention of deliberately and systematically annihilating a group of people. And so you can see that the further you go up to the pinnacle and to the top of the pyramid, the severity of what it is. And if you allow one ring of it to exist and stay there and almost become foundational, it is not beyond the ability to build up upon that and keep doing that and build up. And therefore, that's why it's in a pyramid shape.
Elizabeth.
Yeah. So, oh wait, are there talking points on this one for the steps for conversation? Yeah. So the considerations, I think number one, anytime you're entering these discussions and trying to build bridges in difficult places, the first thing that we have to do is have discussion, not debate. It's so important that we don't ask people to defend their experience. And we consider the racial composition of your spaces, whether it's work, school, communal spaces, and acknowledging the connection of the past to the present, because so often when you see the present, it really is, whether it's the frustration or the anger, it's the bubbling up of what's happened over the past. And that past also serves as the appreciation that we have now for, and Carmen and I were talking earlier about the appreciation and the hope that we have because of the conversations we're having now that are deeply connected to the past. So it's exciting. Having those discussions about cultural, structural racism, again, just because they may not be happening to you, that doesn't mean they're not happening. And the concept of privilege, we have to acknowledge that and be open to talking about that. I always encourage empathy. I think it's important to have that respect, the time of taking the time to reflect, and then finding where that message relates to your own story, I think is critical. I think it's so important to inspire hope and activism. I think that leaders are those who create something so inspiring that people want to be a part of it. And we're seeing that happen now. Our children are not colorblind. They are aware of differences. They are aware of people who have curly hair and flat hair, as it is called in our home. They're not colorblind, and we shouldn't encourage them to be. We should encourage them to have, to see colors and see differences, appreciate them. And I also get the word I don't use the word tolerance. Nobody should be tolerated. They should be accepted and seen for exactly who they are. And we don't just talk about the similarities. And yes, I do think I'm related to everyone and can build a case for that. But I also think it's so important to not only talk about, but value, appreciate, and give space for the differences, because that's where we really come the most multifaceted and the best versions of ourselves, is when those differences are accepted and appreciated.
Definitely.
Discussing incidents of the hate. This is really important to prepare yourself emotionally. It's not easy. And it's really, really hard for my friends now that I'm talking about my experiences with racism. It's hard for them. And it's hard for me too, because I'm also acknowledging that I've had a great deal of shame with the level and the frequency of the concessions I have to make just to function in this world. So it's an emotional conversation, but again, there's a lot of power in those conversations. Open the conversation about what they're hearing. I think these conversations, the really strong common denominator needs to be listening on both sides. Answer questions matter-of-factly and with respect. I would actually change that to perhaps being answer questions authentically. You don't want to come off matter-of-fact, like blasé, like, oh, well, that's too bad. But really allow yourself to sit with those feelings and respond appropriately based on how you're authentically feeling. Be mindful that people of all ages might be struggling to understand, and I think this is particularly important with that gap between the older generation. I know that when I'm building bridges, sometimes people just come from a different time and place, and their rhetoric and their language is different. It doesn't make it hate-filled. They just say things a different way. And my kids have the same thing. So bridging those gaps between those two, building those bridges between those gaps, it's hard, but it's necessary. And really just looking at the intent of the words, because it's not always meant to be offensive. Sometimes, again, it's just reflective of the time and place they came from. Be alert for signs of distress. And my friends know when I'm starting to get anxious, and they'll typically try to step in. But be mindful of those social cues. If somebody's avoiding a question, it's not time to force them to answer it. It's time to say, okay, let's move on, and modify your behavior based on those social cues. Focus on the helpers. I think that's so critical on all sides, rather than looking at the outliers who are causing disruption or the ones that you truly don't agree with. Focus on the helpers, because I think at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. And it's really focusing on those things that are helpful and moving forward, that unify us. And that's so critical, because it keeps the conversation focused on what we have in common and the end goal that we all share. And then the most critical thing, if we're having these discussions and we're learning these truths and we're doing nothing with it, then it's all for naught. So we have to take action in ways that are appropriate and helpful to the cause. And I think that if it's not necessarily your cause, it's so critical that you ask what is helpful and what is harmful before you take decisive action on any one thing. But the discussion is key.
And can I piggyback off of something that you said, Elizabeth, going back to um, uh, empathy, because there's a big difference between empathy and sympathy, you know. But we also realize that in these conversations, we're all not going to agree on some things. Someone's going to have a different perspective of a statement or a word that was said or shared or whatnot. But that is the beauty of the organic, authentic conversation. Sometimes people in general, not just in this case, mix sympathy and empathy together, and those are two different experiences. The empathy is where the power is, because you're opening yourself up to be self-reflective, and you're opening yourself up to have awareness, so that communication between two people takes place. And you're not always going to agree, and that's the beauty of it.
And that's okay.
And that's okay.
That is, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to take all of us.
Yes.
That's really what it boils down to.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Thank you, both of you, so much for walking us through those things. We will be doing an additional 2 webinars in the growth of this conversation. The next one will be on June 26th, and Elizabeth will also be joining us for that as well, to share some more words of wisdom and how to continue to having those difficult and honest conversations. So I know some of you have already started to put things in the chat and with questions and comments. So Courtney will be taking us through those. And ladies, if either of you would like to take the question, feel free to raise your hand or say that you're going to take on that question. Otherwise, we can just kind of bounce them around.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to thank all 3 of you so much for putting on this session today. I'm sure you probably have missed a lot of the chat, but Elizabeth, there are plenty of people in the chat that would love to be related to you. So
I saw that.
you got lots of fans, but I definitely want to go through some of the questions that people had, and if anyone has any other ones, please reach out. So Elizabeth, maybe this is for you. Some people have had questions on the proper terminology to use as to not be offensive. Can you explain the difference between using terms like African American or the Black community are?
Personally, I prefer to be called Black or a person of color. I think African American, to me, it puts a distance between me and being an American. But I also think that's really personal. I prefer Black and person of color, but I think that's just where I stand on it. Carmen, do you agree? Or
I agree. It's really, it's about engaging in the conversation, because when when I was lecturing at the University of Iowa, I had someone come up to me and goes, well, what do you want me to call you? Do you want me to call you Black? Do you want me to call you African American? Do you want me to call you woman of color? And I said, well, my birth certificate says Carmen Shawn, and that's what I would prefer. And then she goes, but I mean, and then we started having the conversation. It matters on which one. Certain people are comfortable with Black, capital B. Some people
and it's okay to ask.
Yeah, just all you have to do is ask. That's
It's
the
okay.
best thing, is ask.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question about someone who is white, and they want to know, what is the best way to approach the Black community?
What are you discussing? I guess, yeah. They just say to approach them just to speak, or
Are involved in the community to learn more?
One, you're courageous, because the temperament of the question sounds a little timid, but I would just ask and start in an area of the community that you feel comfortable and that you have a passion for. If your passion is in healthcare, go to healthcare. And within the African American community, they have a lot of health centers within the African American community that could use your expertise. Go where you feel comfortable. If you're a person of faith, go into an ecumenical setting in which you can engage people. I would think if you have children and one of your children's classmates is African, introduce yourself to that child's parent. I mean, that's going to get you a doorway in. I mean, unless you get invited to the cookout or something like that. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Well, and I think asking is critical. And I learned as a kid, don't just go up and ask any Black person you see. I used to do that at the grocery store because I was so excited to see one. And my mom, and this poor person on the receiving end was like, this is uncomfortable. But if you ask enough people, can I just have an honest conversation with you? I want to have a better understanding. And again, if you're willing to engage in that dialogue rather than the debate, I think you'll find that most people are open to have a conversation. And if they're not, that's okay.
Mhm.
I mean, again, I ask a lot of people a lot of questions because even now, my parents are still white. There's still things I don't know and I don't understand. I still ask my friends those uncomfortable questions. Not all of, I mean, I have my friends that I know are open to that. So I think it's that trial and error, but just never stop asking.
Yeah.
You can ask me. I'm a judgment-free zone. You can ask me anything.
I might crack a joke, but, but I'll tell you.
Great. So another question is, do you think that we are at a tipping point where significant change will take place?
100%.
185%.
100%.
Yes.
100%. Because, and again, I want to be very clear. I do not condone looting. I do not condone rioting. However, the place it had in this particular ecosystem is that it has necessitated change. And now that disruption is going to pass the baton to the rational-minded speaking people committed to change. And then those rational-minded people and speakers are going to pass it on to those who can enact the change. And my hope is that the people that can actually enact the change are going to circle back to the very community that it will benefit and say, what is it that you need? And I know for a fact the Black communities are meeting with leaders and they're meeting with people at the highest levels, so they will have an answer for when that question is asked, so it doesn't get lost and fall by the wayside by several of recent movements that we have seen. We are at a tipping point, and I think what is so critical is that we all work very hard to be on the right side of history, because 20 years from now, this is going to be a pivotal point. I 100% agree, and I'm so hopeful because of that.
Most definitely. Most definitely, because this didn't just happen a couple of weeks ago. This has been happening. If you go through the timeline of things that have been occurring, and oh, well, what are they doing? I mean, we are at that point. I mean, I was just having this conversation with my mother, and she said, this is a little different than when I was a freedom rider. And I was like, yeah, I think so too. So I'm hoping that we will get to the point that we bring about that change and we work and do it together. Most definitely.
Well, I don't know about everyone else on the call, but that gives me a lot of hope and just continued energy to keep doing the work that all of us are doing. We have I think we have time for one other question. Kat, I think this is for you. What should we do if there is an incident of hate at our children's school or in the community?
That's a great question. So one of the many things that the ADL does is we track incidents of hate and hate crimes. And of course, we encourage folks to reach out to law enforcement when it's appropriate, but to report it to the ADL as well. We offer a program called Incident Response, where people can go and fill out the information, share it with us. And then because of the wonderful relationships that we have in our community at ADL Nevada in particular, we're able to help build bridges for issues. We're able to help connect resources to people and really help provide a holistic response. It is one of the things that I pride ADL on the most, is that we truly take tracking that information seriously. And also on top of that, we also use it as part of reporting to other law enforcement groups to help them track data and understand what's going on in communities. And it is truly an easy thing to do. And then Carmen here in just a moment is going to be talking about something that schools can do in addition to what happens at your child's school. Carmen?
All right, well, we'll go ahead and jump ahead. I think this is under additional support. Is at the ADL, one of the resources that they do provide for schools, and from what I've heard from some conversations from colleagues, this is something that's definitely going to be seen more prevalently, hopefully here in our school district. The site that I work at, we are considered what's called a No Place for Hate school, where we have some implementation of some educational things and activities to address if you see something that happens at the school, where you go, where you get support system. And a lot of it is student driven with guidance from the administration and an administrative team that overlooks that. And it's to help the school community, because when your children are in a school, they are within a community and a culture for a large period of time. And I know some of the parents out there like, well, when is it going to go over again? Because you've had them for a while with the shutdown. So I know you're ready for them to go back to school. But it also teaches them skills to self-direct how to do that, and then provide the support system that if they go and report to an organization or to the person on campus responsible, and they can do it anonymously or they can do it face-to-face, they can do that. One of the things that we do at our school is that we have something where it's done anonymously, and then you have the choice to confront and work through that framework. And so it fosters a culture, a campus culture of respect on it whatsoever. So that's one of the ways. But I do know that in schools, there is a mechanism in each school that on how to report that, because we're required to address that.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for sharing that. Elizabeth would like to address one more question before we wrap up, and I appreciate everyone who's able to stay on for a few more minutes. So go ahead.
Thank you. And I just saw Mr. Kaufman's comment, and it says, although I agree with most of what you said, I can't agree that we should teach our children to not be colorblind. The fact that a person is Black or Asian or whatever makes no difference. They're all the same, even if they don't look the same. We should be colorblind. And I want to address that because my friends looked at me being colorblind. And so because they were colorblind, they didn't understand that I am on the receiving end of racism. And each culture has its own form of racism. I'm also mixed with Japanese, and that side of my family completely rejected me because I'm called a hafu. And in the Japanese culture, which is, extremely homogeneous, that's a different level of racism. But I also minored in Japanese, so I appreciate that culture and I understand why it is the way that it is. My Alpha Latinas, they're dealing with a very different form of racism. And even the the family dynamics are different. And what I learned in middle school when all these different ethnic groups took me in and taught me is every group has its own different experiences, culture, music, and everything else. And the more that we dilute that to be the same, we lose that flavor and we lose that perspective. And it's so important. So I teach my kids like, oh, look at Harrison. Harrison's dad's from the Middle East. We should learn more about that. And it's not to, not to create division, but to create a level of acceptance, knowing that each color and each person brings their own unique perspective and challenges. And my sons know that no matter who they see on the receiving end of hatred, or that people make choices to hate people or not be kind because they're different, my sons know that whoever is on the receiving end of that, it's their job to be a helper and make sure that that person knows that they're not alone. But if I don't teach them that that can be anybody and that can be everyone because of specific reasons, we're going to lose that. So I do understand what you're saying, but there are so many nuances to especially when it comes to racism, that we really do have to see color, because the fight is different for all of us.
Most definitely. Yeah, that is something that and that was something that was really populated in the late 70s, the term of color blindness, in order that we're together. But see, that's the issue, and that gets into the microaggressive behavior and the commentary, is because you have to see, as one of our guests just said, you have to see people for who they are, what their perspective is, and you have to know their narrative. And so it's about appreciation, and because that's what it is. You want to raise your children to be based off of your belief system and to love people, but you also have that nuance of understanding difference, and difference doesn't have to be strange. It's just different, and then you expand their opportunity, because they're going to end up working with people that are different than them, living amongst people that are different than them, worshiping with people that are different than them. Yes.
Thank you so much, ladies, both of you. Elizabeth, I really appreciate you took the time to answer that additional question. And so we're going to wrap up here. We're a little bit over time, and I want to respect everyone's afternoon today. So Courtney just put in the chat the link to register for our next webinar. which is on June 26th. It is at the same time, same place. So we'll be here in the same location, online, in your living room, or wherever you may take this call. And we are looking forward to continuing this conversation with you all as things continue. Courtney?
I wanted to add that some of the questions that didn't get answered will actually be covered definitely in the next 2 sessions, and I made notes of them. So please definitely join us and register. And if you do have more questions, I know Kat's going to put her email address on. So you definitely can send us emails and we'll make sure and get them answered as well.
Absolutely. If there was anything that we missed today or you are hoping to cover in a future session, all of you should have received an email with that registration link with my email in it. And you can reply directly to me, and I will work with Carmen and Elizabeth both to help gather that data and information for you. And Julie, to your question, of course, you're absolutely allowed to invite others. Tell everyone that you know and email all of your neighbors. We would love to have more participants join us next time for continuing this conversation. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Happy Juneteenth. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Happy Juneteenth.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Hey, Kat, love you.
Love you
Have
too.
a great day. Bye-bye. Perfect. Bye.
Sorry, I missed the email address earlier. Can you guys share again?
Yep, I'll put it right in the chat right now. Hold on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you, Kathy.
All right, Carmen, it looks like we need to just have a room one day where where we can answer all these questions.
I know, huh?
I'm going back through the chat and I'm like, man, we didn't get to.
Yeah. I was reading some of them and I was like, oh, I want to, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. I'm like, oh.
Katrina, is that something that would be possible? Like maybe have like an after hours or like a room where we continue the conversation? Because gosh,